Hello, good evening. So negotiating teams have been appointed. The first round of talks between the US and Russia have been held. The end to the war in Ukraine could be in sight, but on what terms and at what cost? Donald Trump, the businessman turned president who has never really stopped being a businessman, has been clear right from the outset that he wants a quick deal. But, as every businessman will tell you, a quick deal comes at a high price. And things are moving very quickly indeed. I mean, the change in US policy is enough to give you whiplash. Just look at this. This happened in just the last month.
America stands strong with our allies. We never bend down. We bend down to no one. Certainly not Putin. And now, nearly 3 years later, Putin has failed to take Kyiv, failed to make large territorial gains, and failed to break NATO.
When Putin says that he really wants peace, do you believe him?
Yeah, I do. I believe he wants peace. I believe that President Putin, when I spoke to him yesterday, I mean, I know him very well. Yeah, I think he wants peace. I think he would tell me if he didn't.
I mean, it's quite the contrast. Now, the negotiations have started with no Europe and no Ukraine at the table. And yet the reality is that it's Europe, and above all Ukraine, who'll end up paying the high price for this quick deal. Donald Trump has been clear, no US boots on the ground to try and keep the peace in Ukraine. Now, today in Saudi Arabia, the US and Russia sat down together, something that would have been unimaginable just a month ago. Instead, that will fall to Europe, who'll be scrambling to play catch up. Now, the UK has so far committed £12.8 billion to Ukraine. That number is set to rise. And if Donald Trump really means it when he says Europe can't rely on the US for defence and security, defence spending will need to go up many times of that. So, of course, diplomacy with the US is now in overdrive.
In the middle of everything else last week, the new Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, from the US and I, made time to discuss the aims we share on defence reform.
I will go to Washington next week to meet President Trump and to discuss what we see as the key elements of a lasting peace. I spoke to President Zelenskyy on Friday and will do so again in coming days. And we envisage a further meeting with European colleagues when I return from the US.
Well, a quick deal could end up coming with a very high price tag indeed. Let's find out, shall we, if we did get any closer to a deal today then. Here's our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, with tonight's first report from Kyiv.
Positive, upbeat and constructive. The US assessment of this extraordinary meeting, a thawing of ties between two foes on ice since Russia invaded Ukraine. Kyiv on the agenda, but not in the room.
The goal is to bring an end to this conflict in a way that's fair, enduring, sustainable, and acceptable to all parties involved. What that looks like, well, that's what the ongoing engagement is going to be all about.
Russia's top diplomat called the 4-hour discussion in Saudi Arabia useful and gave an indication of Moscow's red lines on Ukraine.
We explained today that the presence of troops from NATO countries, but under a foreign flag, under the flag of the European Union or under national flags, it doesn't change anything in this regard. This is, of course, unacceptable to us.
Ominous words for Ukraine's president, putting on a brave face on a visit to Turkey. Volodymyr Zelenskyy wants British and other foreign forces on the ground to secure any ceasefire deal. In a sign of his displeasure at the talks between Washington and Moscow, he ditched a plan to travel on to Saudi Arabia.
I am convinced that for Ukraine and for our region, for Europe, it is critical that any negotiations to end the war are not happening behind the backs of the key parties affected by the Russian aggression.
In central Kyiv, a memorial to those who gave their lives fighting Russia's invasion. A reminder, too, of the role America has played in supporting Ukraine. It makes the actions by Donald Trump all the harder for Ukrainians to understand.
What they're doing is crazy because it's our problem. It's a problem between us and this country, Russia. And if they don't want to talk straight with us, this is really strange.
Unfortunately, in our world, I'm afraid it's not democracy already, but it is a power of strongest. It is pity. It is big pity.
Washington's new envoy to Ukraine is due here in the coming hours, but Keith Kellogg may well receive a frosty reception. President Zelensky's decision to head home rather than go to Saudi Arabia sends the clearest possible signal that he's not joking when he says Ukraine will never accept any peace talks that happen without its direct involvement. This country does want an end to Russia's war, but it needs clear guarantees Vladimir Putin won't attack again. Otherwise, all this sacrifice would have been in vain. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Kyiv.
Well, the UK Defence Secretary John Healey has been warning that decisions made over the coming weeks will define the conflict in Ukraine and also the security of our world for generations to come. But with defence spending set to rise, Sky News understands that other government departments are preparing for what could be very difficult spending cuts. Here's our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen.
European leaders round the table, reeling from US peace talks with Russia and wrangling over who provides security now. The Defence Secretary, speaking in London this morning, said it was time for the biggest shake-up of defence in 50 years.
At this time, we must rearm Britain. The decisions that we make right now over the coming weeks will not only define the outcome of the conflict in Ukraine, but the security of our world for a generation to come.
Last week, the US Defence Secretary delivered the stark message that Europe must spend more. Britain has committed nearly £8 billion to Ukraine since the war started, but this government has not said when it will meet its election promise to increase defence spending to 2.5% of national income. Decisions on defence are expected in the spring, just before Rachel Reeves tells government departments how much they can spend for the next 3 years. I'm told unprotected departments have been asked to model spending cuts of up to 11% by the end of that period. Those making the decisions are finding them incredibly difficult. Defence spending is currently 2.3%. Getting it to 2.5 would mean spending another £6 billion a year by the end of this Parliament. Spending on the NHS, defence and some areas of education are protected. But that means the Justice Department, responsible for prisons, local government, the environment, Home Office and culture, may face a spending squeeze.
I think the government is going to be quite wary of raising taxes further. Now, I certainly wouldn't rule out raising taxes further. In fact, I'll be very surprised if we don't get further increases over the next few years, I'm afraid. But very clearly, more money for defence means less money for other things.
The Treasury say departments were asked to deliver savings and efficiencies of 5%, and scenarios of more than that are not final and will be discussed in the coming months. Tough decisions for Keir Starmer and his Chancellor. Tamara Cohen.
Well, someone who knows all too well the pressures on the military budget is the former Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace. It's great to have you with us. So the US and Russia have started negotiations on a possible deal to end the war in Ukraine. I mean, is that something to be welcomed?
Look, I think people talking about it is fine, right? But so far it hasn't really got off to a very good start. The United States basically took off the table all of its potential commitments, so it effectively removed its own skin from the game. And at the same time, Zelenskyy was excluded, as was members of Europe. I mean, not just the EU, but Britain and everyone else, the other stakeholders. So as we've seen today already, it's slightly unravelled. You know, you've got Lavrov being very clear that his red line is no foreign troops under whatever badge, NATO, European Union flag, UN flag, he said is totally unacceptable, were his words. Now, that's rather interesting because, you know, why could possibly Russia not want any peacekeepers in Ukraine? Because, of course, the reality is, you know, I know Putin will be back for more. He was back for more in 2014, so they don't want that. And secondly, Zelenskyy isn't involved and isn't in the room. And understandably, Zelenskyy represents the country that is under attack and is the ones that are having to make the sacrifice. And I find it very interesting. Russia is up to its old tricks, telling Ukraine what it can do with its own territory. You can't have these troops. You can't do this. I don't understand. Russia doesn't seem to understand it's a sovereign nation. It's not in Russia's gift to dictate to other countries. So it's not got off to a great start, but it is to some extent a start, but we'll see.
I mean, it's interesting. You're pretty concerned clearly about that. And it feels to me what you wrote in the Telegraph in the wake of the Munich Security Conference this weekend is quite important. I wonder if you could expand a bit on it. You said this year's gathering seems set to mirror the disastrous conference of 1938, where the continent stood blind in the face of Hitler's duplicity. The stench of appeasement is once again returning to Munich.
Yeah, well, so the Munich conference of 1938 was characterised by two issues. One was appeasement. If we just give Hitler a little bit more, it'll all be fine. Just give him bits of Czechoslovakia. And also Czechoslovakia weren't in the room. So the Allies handed over, territory that wasn't even theirs to hand over. And the second part of the characteristic was all along Hitler had a different plan. He was duplicitous insofar as he had planned to expand the German Nazi regime anyhow. So he was deceiving them from day one. And I think what we can tell by Russia's actions in the past is Russia's not going to abandon its plan to absorb Ukraine into a greater Russia. Putin wrote that in an article himself the year before, that Ukraine isn't really the country that we all think it is. And secondly, the Europeans, including the United Kingdom, if they're not careful, will be seen to run away from their obligations in protecting that security of Ukraine.
Just to be clear, you think that the West, I guess, the US, Europe, is appeasing Russia potentially in the same way that Hitler was appeased before World War II?
Well, I think Donald Trump's opening gambit on the negotiations looked like appeasement, taking everything off the table before the negotiations had started. If you remember, he said, we won't put American boots on the ground, we won't give a security guarantee, Ukraine will have to basically accept the loss of its territory. I mean, what was the left to negotiate? And I think, ultimately, I see two sides. I see those that protect international law, uphold human rights, don't inflict war crimes on people, and respect sovereign borders and don't think they should be changed by force. That is predominantly the West. And I see Russia, who has no qualms about breaking that. And there's no equivalence here, but I'm afraid those that wish to appease seem to try and make Putin the equivalent of Zelenskyy, or in fact more stronger or senior to Zelenskyy. Donald Trump today wouldn't answer the question of whether he saw them as equals. And I think in that very fact, that is an appeasement.
Donald Trump, after he got off the phone to Putin last week, said, I believe he wants peace. I know him very well. I think he wants peace. I think he would tell me if he didn't.
Well, I think he wants peace. He's lost 700,000 soldiers, most of his land forces. He's either lost them dead, killed, dead, injured or deserted. I mean, he has actually suffered huge losses. He's now got Sweden and Finland in NATO. He's one of the most sanctioned nations on earth. Russia is now lesser as a result of his actions. Of course, he wants peace, but he doesn't want to give up his views of a greater Russia and his determination to absorb Ukraine. And I think that's the thing he has to accept, that he's not going to be able to do that.
Let's talk about peacekeeping forces, because you mentioned there at the beginning of the interview the idea of peacekeeping forces and what that would look like. I mean, Keir Starmer said he's willing to send UK troops there to act as a peacekeeping force. I mean, obviously, we've got the Russian response to that, saying that they wouldn't accept it. But is that the UK showing leadership? Do you welcome that?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's been talked about for some time. I mean, Britain had troops in Ukraine before the invasion, as did Sweden, Canada and the United States. After 2014, something called Operational Orbital, we went in to help build their capacity. Wasn't a combat deployment in the way that Russia would allege. We just trained people and helped them be better forces. So we've been there a long time. It is Ukraine's right to invite nations, not Russia's right, onto its soil. I would support it. But there's another part of the US messaging that I don't think the penny has really dropped yet in Europe, which was the very clear remarks by both the US Secretary of State for Defence at NATO and followed up by the Vice President, that Europe has to carry a greater weight of contributing to its own security and therefore Ukraine's security, because Ukraine is obviously Europe. We've been deaf to it for a decade. Obama started this. And so therefore the other part of this is, if we're going to put men and women of the British Armed Forces potentially in harm's way, we need to invest in our defence, properly invest, not a little bit of smoke and mirrors.
What would a proper investment look like? What do you want to see? Because Donald Trump said 5% of GDP. most people I've spoken to on this programme say
5%.
that's unrealistic. But what?
Well, America
is
isn't at 5%. There are two halves to this. So it's first of all, you've got to get to whatever level you want to. You can't just.
What is the right level? Do you
So I think 3% by 2030, and the waypoint on the way to that is 2.5 by 27 or 26, because you have to be able to actually spend the money you're given. You can't just grow a battleship in a year. You can't suddenly recruit thousands of people. You can't. You have to invest, and it takes time. So, if I was in the Treasury, it has to be a sustainable growth in your budget. I think it would be unfair to demand of the government that they immediately spend 3% tomorrow morning, because if you did spend 3% tomorrow morning, it simply wouldn't be spent. But you need a rising budget that gets you to, I think, 3%. And if we were all on 3%, I think we would be able to not only defend ourselves, but take action wherever we wish to defend ourselves and our allies.
I mean, I guess some people listening to this would think it's a bit rich coming from a Conservative politician, right? You hear John Healey saying, well, the first thing that the Conservatives did when they got into power in 2010 was to cut the defence budget.
Yeah, well, it's a bit rich. In 1997, they cut the defence budget as soon as they got in. I mean, I think that the comments I have made...
But it's fair, though, isn't it? You yourself say the army's been
I increased the defence budget by £31 billion, right? So no one else had done that You
didn't get to 2.5% of GDP there,
No,
did you?
but I took it from a much lower 2% right up to 2.3%. If you look at the significant decreases in defence, I've always said it, and it's been twisted, I'm afraid, by the Labour Party, which I think is beneath them. I have said that for decades, both Labour and the Conservative hollowed out defence, right? They took spending at about 3.8% of GDP in 1991, and they continue to cut it and cut it and cut it and cut it and hollow it out because there was a peace dividend after the Cold War. That's perfectly understandable. But they kept on taking, and it became corporate raiding. And only when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, he gave me a record settlement, a proper budget, to try and turn that round. All the governments of all colours have reduced defence spending, and it's either been feast or famine. But fundamentally, it has been a downward trajectory. I think when Labour came into power, it was 3% of GDP. I think when they left, it went down to 2.1, and then it rose up again to 2.5 after the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. But we still ended up with snatched Land Rovers and hollowed out forces. Fundamentally, we need a long-term plan that says 3% by 2030, no smoke or mirrors. And there are plenty of people in both parties who believe this. This is not about all right for you as a Tory to say it, all right for you as a Labour Party. John Healey absolutely is a supporter of more money on defence. He just said it again today. His challenge is, will he get it from his Chancellor, and will his Prime Minister convert the words into actions?
Just finally, do we need to be more joined up with Europe? Because as you say, one of the big messages to come out from America is, look, Europe, you guys need to step up. So does that mean, if we are going to be more strategic about this, we need much more joined up thinking about European capability?
Well, we're lucky that we have actually an even older alliance than the EU, NATO, which is, 75 years old plus, that has been in place, designed specifically for joining up. And that's what it does. It's an alliance, a military alliance. We train together, we exercise together, we sometimes procure together. So that's all there. What America is saying, you've got to pull your weight, you've got to step up to the plate and contribute to your security. And that is not arguing over 0.2% of GDP and little bits here and little bit there. That is a fundamental reprioritising of all of our political priorities at home to fund it. That's the real question the Americans are asking us. Do you really want to take care of security? And if you do, you're going to have real cuts to other budgets to deliver it. And a Prime Minister's job is to choose. To lead is to choose. No more smoke and mirrors, no more everyone's a winner, there aren't really any cuts, no more we'll just cut lots of civil servants and magically we'll have a budget. Keir Starmer needs to stand up and say, today I'm cutting the roads budget or the aid budget or the pensions bill or the benefits bill or whatever it is to show that defence is a higher priority than it's been in the past.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Really interesting to speak. Ben Wallace speaking to us there, the former Defence Secretary. Now, the continuing debate surrounding defence and the war in Ukraine is sure to feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the chief leader writer at The Observer, Sonia Soda, and the political journalist and broadcaster, Theo Usherwood. Right, let's bring in our panel for this evening, shall we? The former Downing Street Director of Communications, Cain, and the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Stacey Cooper. Great to have you both with us. Just to pick up on the final part there of Ben Wallace's interview, he said, look, the Prime Minister needs to be clear. He says we're going to have to cut this budget, which could be painful, which could be difficult, in order to reinvest more in defence. I mean, is he right, do you think?
Well, it's always the first instinct of a Conservative to try and cut public services, and we think that would be the wrong way to do it. We Liberal Democrats have said that there are other ways that you could raise money in a fairer way without having to cut public services. So, for example, you could raise taxes on the big tech companies, you could raise taxes on the big gaming companies, you could reform capital gains tax in a way that would be much fairer and would raise more money than the Labour Party has raised through its changes to capital gains tax. And those three measures alone would raise several £billion a year. That is a way in which you could raise the money from taxing big companies that have made billions of pounds in profits without having to cut into public services, which, quite frankly, is still on their knees.
Isn't that kind of what he's saying? He's saying, look, you know, we can't have this thing where, like, everyone's a winner, where there's no painful decisions. If you're going to raise that kind of money for defence, someone's going to lose. Who would be losing?
Well, if you reformed capital gains tax in the way that we would suggest, then the 0.01% richest people in the country would be losers because they would be paying more in capital gains tax. If you increased, the tech tax or the digital services tax, then the big tech companies would have to pay those taxes. If you put taxes on the big gaming companies, then the gaming companies themselves would pay it either out of their profits or they would pass that on to people who use their gaming products. So those would be the people who would be having to pay. I would much rather that those people pay rather than people who were stuck on an NHS waiting list.
Lee, what do you reckon?
I think that undoubtedly we probably do need to invest more in defence. Whether we can get to 3% is questionable. I think the idea that we can fund that through taxes on tech companies and further taxes on business when we've already had pretty punitive taxes on business over the last, within the last budget, business is deeply unhappy and howling really already, and the economy's getting deeply squeezed. A lot of these big tech companies will find more inviting environments than the UK and go elsewhere. So I think it could have, difficult impact on our economy. And I think the choices fundamentally might be deeper. If we're going to get towards 3%. Where are they going to get the money from? I think there are some really, really hard choices for the government and for the Chancellor ahead on how you're going to fund that kind of defence spending, because it is a significant sum that we're talking about.
Should we talk a little bit about the geopolitics as well? Because, look, we've got this situation where you have Donald Trump talking to Vladimir Putin on the phone. The US and Russia are opening up talks about what happens to Ukraine. Where is the UK here? Do you think that Keir Starmer is showing leadership, or do you think he should be doing more, and what?
I mean, I have to say, I think it's absolutely outrageous what is happening. The fact that Ukraine is not at the table and front and centre of these negotiations, along with Europe and the UK, I think it really is outrageous that has happened. I think in terms of leadership, well, Keir Starmer has said that there may have to be boots on the ground. We Liberal Democrats have said that we would support that move. We think that is showing leadership. But what we've also said is that we think that Parliament needs to have a debate on these issues because things are moving very, very quickly. This is an era-defining moment in our, not just in our domestic politics, but in European politics and global politics as well. I think when Keir Starmer goes to Washington next week, we would like him to go with a really strong mandate so he can say that the whole of the British Parliament is behind him, and we want to get that debate and that vote as soon as possible.
I think that I agree that Zelenskyy should be part of any peace negotiations. I also think it's a good thing that we're moving close to a discussion on a peace process and what that may look like. We've had a generation of young people in the East who have, been absolutely decimated from a war. So I think any step towards peace is a positive thing. I think from a European point of view, I think there's a question of what is the outcome, the best realistic outcome that we want, and how do we achieve that? Do we want to continue as we are, which is huge cost to the economy, huge cost to lives in the East for, what we're seeing is slow but continual Russian gains? Do we look to put boots on the ground, the cost with that and the potential element for escalation with that and the damages that could do? Or do we look to find a peaceful solution? Now, that might be the best, worst outcome. None of them are particularly good, and I think it's a very difficult situation for the government to find themselves in to navigate out of that. And it seems that basically the Americans are cutting Europe out, and I think that's more of a broader, troubling issue of, if you're Keir Starmer, which way do you go? Do you go towards the Americans? We've got further economic issues, you've got tariffs, you've got all of these broader questions. or do you move towards Europe? And some of the consequences that could have. And I think these are going to be fundamental questions for the next 5 to 10 years.
Lots more from both of you on the programme. Thank you very much indeed. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, the former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott warns Donald Trump against a peace deal with Russia that leaves Ukraine broken. My full interview with him from the ARC conference, that's next.
Big stories don't always come from big cities. I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent.
You are not getting in this elevator, okay?
The judge made it very clear that she could see no justifiable reason why Sakulas wasn't here facing British justice.
I promised I would get him justice.
Free, wherever you get your news. This is what they're up against, that the wind is the really big problem. It is back-breaking work and the smoke is thick. It's been working well. Water levels are dropping, but no one knows what impact further rain will have. What would you do if this place wasn't open? This is the exact spot in Nottingham where their 19-year-old son, Barnaby Webber, lost his life.
I just think it's so cruel and so harsh.
It's really scary. We're terrified.
In this community, I'm told that everybody knows someone affected by COVID.
Hopefully this will be the last wave.
Sky News gets the full story first. Change seems tantalisingly close in this corner of the UK. Wales was the first to introduce the plastic bag charge. It's legal to let go. Set the speed and take the hands off. It's almost driverless, but not quite. Hans is a highly trained police dog. The force is incredible. It's really frightening, actually. This is my patch, my specialism. It's also my home.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
We're back here in London. The future of the political right is being debated at Jordan Peterson's Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference, which is taking place this week. Lots of people present are admirers of Donald Trump, including Nigel Farage, but one former leader there today, the former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, warned the president to avoid a peace deal that leaves Ukraine broken. I sat down with him earlier and started by asking if he feels that the foundations of Western civilization have been damaged.
Well, I certainly think that the fundamentals of Western civilization are very sound, particularly here in Britain, because Britain is, after all, the country that's given us the world's common language, the mother of parliaments, the rule of law, the emancipation of minorities, the Industrial Revolution, most of the world's sports. This is a great country.
So you're trying to suck up to our viewers here, then?
That too often has suffered from a defeatism and a declinism which I'd like to see banished, absolutely banished. And while it might be most intense in Britain, I think throughout the Anglosphere, there's been this long-term defeatism and declinism. Throughout the Anglosphere, there's been this sense that we should be troubled by our past. America is troubled by slavery, Britain is troubled by the empire, Australia is troubled by Indigenous dispossession. Sure, nothing is perfect, but on balance, these are the best countries in the world. Western civilization has given the world the best societies there have ever been. We should be quietly proud and we should build on our strengths. And this conference is about telling a better story, a story of success and a story of future achievement, a future that can be better than the past if we believe in ourselves.
Who do you blame for that defeatism and declinism? Is that politicians, do you think, or?
Well, I certainly think that there's been a lot of substandard leadership. I guess I have to blame myself as a former senior politician and Prime Minister in Australia. But I think part of the problem has been what has been described as the long march of the left through the institutions. In Australia, for instance, for at least a generation, our National Day hasn't been something to be celebrated by teachers. It's been something to be deprecated as Invasion Day. And I suspect that in most British classrooms, the story of British history is not the wonderful Long Island story enunciated by Winston Churchill and understood in those days by every Briton, but it's more a story of shame, even though slavery, that gruesome institution, more than any other country, Britain stamped out the international slave trade.
I mean, I'm not sure it's a story of shame. I wouldn't go that far. My own experience of British classrooms is, it's not too much
more
about,
recent than mine.
Yeah. Well, it's not too much about, kind of shame, I wouldn't have said, right?
But, I mean, let's think of this country. I mean, not only did Britain effectively abolish the global slave trade, the Royal Navy spent the best part of a century patrolling West Africa to stop it. But Britain also saved civilization in the Second World War against Nazism. This is a wonderful story, and Britons in particular should be more quietly self-confident about the future, and they should be bursting with pride about the past.
I'm interested, because you talked there about the kind of military history, which is certainly something that many British people are very proud of when you talk about, the defeat of Nazism, for example.
And the tragedy today is that the British Army is now smaller than at any time since the Napoleonic era.
Well, that's it, and it does feel, doesn't it, that, it brings us, in a way, to what is happening with Ukraine,
and
right?
Keir Starmer, I think, quite sensibly and bravely, has indicated that Britain is prepared to make a substantial British troop contribution to a stabilisation force in Ukraine to ensure that never again can Putin launch the kind of aggressive war that he has. He's also suggested that America's got to be there. Well, no. Frankly, Britain should be prepared to do this with European allies, if possible, but if necessary, on its own. I mean, Britain is a substantial power. After the United States, it's the second most powerful country, notwithstanding the current weakness of the British Army, and it should be prepared to take a stand for freedom by protecting Ukraine.
What Keir Starmer said is that he's prepared to commit troops on the ground if there is a US backstop. And for many people, they would say
but why should Britain want a US backstop?
Because the Russian army is clearly, as you've acknowledged for the size of the British army, the Russian army is clearly far superior to the British army. I mean, many people would say that... No, that's a fact, though.
Sophie, Britain should be prepared to lead here, and it shouldn't it should not expect yet again to ride on America's coattails.
Should British peacekeeping forces have the protection of NATO?
Well, I certainly think they should, but even if they don't, they have the protection of the British nuclear deterrent. Now, there is no reason why Britain couldn't assemble a substantial coalition of countries to help here. Why wouldn't the French help, for instance? I mean, France is a significant military power. France has its independent nuclear deterrent. I am sure as part of the AUKUS arrangements, Britain could talk to Australia about Australia making a contribution.
Do you think that Australia should be potentially part of some sort of force as well?
I personally think that Australia should be prepared to make a contribution to the long-term freedom and security of Ukraine, because the point that
to the Russian dictator. I mean, is there a chance that that is exactly what he's doing here?
Well, I think he will blight his second presidency if that's how it starts. I really think it would be a blight on his presidency if the result of anything the American president does is to leave Ukraine broken, defenceless, and ultimately a colony of Imperial Russia. I think that would be a tragedy, and it's precisely to ensure that that doesn't happen that other countries, and as I said, I think it's good that Keir Starmer seems to want to take a lead here, other countries, led by Britain, should be prepared to do what's necessary to keep Ukraine free.
Now, just to bring us back to the United Kingdom, you back Kemi Badenoch for leader. How do you think she's doing?
Look, I have a lot of respect and friendship for Kemi. I think she's doing well. I know something about leading parties in opposition. The toughest time is the very start, because people look at you through the lens of the former government, which they've gotten rid of. I think the longer this government lasts, the better Kemi and the Conservative Party is going to look.
And I guess the other thing for Kemi Badenoch is she's got reform to worry about too. Just finally, if you were in the UK, if you were a citizen in the UK, I know it's probably hard to imagine, but who would you vote for? Reform or Conservatives?
Of course I'd be voting for the Conservatives. I mean, the Conservative Party is the oldest and most successful political party anywhere in the world, and I think it's got a pretty good future.
Do you think they should do a deal with Reform?
I'm not going to give advice. As a Conservative, I'm certainly in favour of competition as a general principle, and if people want to come up with a strong and effective critique of the current government, if people want to come up with competing plans for a better Britain, well, fair enough, let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie.
All right, let's chat to Lee and Daisy, shall we? Lots to unpick there. Lee, we've been talking an awful lot about peacekeeping forces. There you heard Tony Abbott say, look, you know, Europe can't ride on Americans' coattails, and UK should do it alone if needed. What do you make of it?
I think it'd be quite courageous potentially to do it without some sort of American involvement, and I think, frankly, it's unrealistic. I don't think the government will split from the Americans. I think we're going to have an awful lot of hot air at the moment as the negotiations going on, a lot of red lines, both sides, that, you know, I think we should probably take a step back and see what the shape of a deal will look like. But I think we would want to remain part of NATO, part of whatever force that would then go into a negotiation. I think going independently could be
courageous.
Yes.
That's what you said.
Yes.
I feel like that was
in the Westminster sense, I think, yes.
What do you make of it?
Well, look, I think the first thing that we ought to be doing here in the UK is restoring our troop numbers. You know, I mean, it's pretty unforgivable that under the Conservatives, you know, our troop numbers were cut by 10,000 to the lowest level since the Napoleonic Wars. And that has to actually, you know, that really does have to be the first step. And it wouldn't cost that much in the grand scheme of things. So I think getting that immediate commitment to rebuild our own troop numbers and reverse that 10,000 troop cuts is the priority. But as we've said before, we do think that it's right to call for boots on the ground. And we hope that the UK can show some leadership amongst other European countries to galvanise some energy in that direction.
Lee, you touched on it earlier when you were saying that, look, there's almost like a repositioning going on across the world, and the UK might have to be making some choices about whether we try and wed as closely as possible to the US or hug Europe a bit tighter. I mean, where do you think we should be going?
I suspect we will inevitably move towards the Americans again. I think, you know, the UK is generally at its strongest when it's that bridge between Europe and America. There's a great role to be played there, and I think at the moment Italy and Meloni seem to be taking that space with some of the Americans. But I think when you look at how intertwined we are with our sort of, you know, nuclear deterrent, you know, when you look at how intertwined we are with our economy and tariffs, I suspect there'll be a big push from particularly the deep state to move towards the Americans.
Well, I think if you were talking strictly in trade terms only, we certainly can see a world in which you would do some kind of closer deal with the EU, and we've called for a bespoke customs union between the UK and the EU that would enable British businesses to trade goods more freely and get rid of some of the red tape that was introduced through Brexit. But you could see a deal with the US potentially on services, as long as our NHS and our farmers were protected through that deal. But clearly what we're seeing is that this isn't just about trade, is it? And there's many things that are outside of our control. What's really important, though, is that when you think about President Trump, I think strength is the only language language that he knows. And if we are going to look like a strong country, we have to have other options on the table to show that we can, if necessary, walk away. And that's why I think it's really important that we do start those negotiations with the EU about having a closer trading relationship, because we need to have different options on the table.
Yeah, always a good tactic in any negotiation, that, isn't it? I feel like you're desired by someone else is always a good one. Thanks both very much indeed. Well, there's been an awful lot of discussion about Donald Trump this evening, but someone who's made no secret of not exactly being a fan of the US president is the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, and tonight he has defended his past criticism of Mr Trump, but in a U-turn since calling on the government to ban the president's 2017 UK state visit, he did say that Donald Trump would now be welcome to visit the capital. He was speaking to our chief political correspondent, John Craig.
What about a Trump state visit here, though? Because it's thought that he wants one. You said at one point you had a slogan, London is for everyone. Does that include President Trump?
Well, absolutely. You know, I want President Trump to come to London so he can see that some of the misunderstandings he has of our city aren't the case. So he can see there is no threat to freedom of speech in this great city of ours. So he can see that actually Muslims, Jews, Christians, Hindus, Sikhs don't just tolerate each other. We respect, celebrate and embrace each other. So he can see for himself the fact that diversity is a strength, not a weakness. So he can see for himself that many people in this great city of ours and country of ours love America, love American culture. Indeed, in the past, have loved American politics and are looking forward to working closely with the USA going forward. It is possible to be close to the USA and close to the European Union as well. It's not a zero-sum game.
What about those insults, though? Racist, sexist, homophobe. Do you still believe that about President Trump?
Well, I think President Trump has fairly and squarely won a second term. Let's judge President Trump on what he does during his second term rather than what he did in his first term. My job as the mayor of this great city is to stand up for our values, stand up for our businesses, stand up for our people. And that does mean sometimes saying boo to a goose. And listen, we had a situation a couple of days ago where it was said words to the effect that the biggest threat facing our country and our continent is a lack of freedom of speech. Woe betide me being criticised for exercising my freedom of speech.
Well, we can chat now to our chief political correspondent, John Craig. So, John, how do you find Sadiq when you speak to him earlier?
Well, he's not using all those dreadful words like racist, homophobe and all that anymore.
He wasn't jumping to repeat them, was he?
I liked it when he said you've got to say boo to a goose from time to time. He did go on to criticise J.D. Vance there for that speech that the Vice President made on Valentine's Day at the Munich conference. And he said that he was wrong about free speech. And he backed the Prime Minister for his talking to other European leaders and going to America then. He's completely out of step with Sir Keir Starmer on freedom of movement, this youth scheme of mobility scheme and so on. But he's trying to be a bit... I said to him, you're not being very helpful to the Prime Minister. You've got reform ahead of the Labour Party in the polls, and you're banging on about, closer ties with Europe, not helping the Labour Party. And he said, no. He said, I'm looking after my city and so on. When I asked him about the trade tariffs, he did suggest that perhaps some American companies doing business in London might suffer a bit if there was to be a trade war. So I think Sadiq Khan a little bit more on message. I don't know whether do you remember there was a junior peer, a junior Labour minister in the Lords, who actually said a period of silence from you would help. Well, he's not going to be silent, but he's a bit less outspoken and a bit less combative, if you like. He's trying to be a bit more diplomatic. He was actually at a meeting with a lot of diplomats today, the EU ambassador and the ambassadors from all the 27 states. So he was on a diplomatic charm offensive, and perhaps that extended to Sky News.
I love it. Yeah, much more diplomatic stance from the London Mayor. John, thank you very much indeed, John Craig there. But if you scan the QR code on your screen right now, you can listen to the latest edition of the Sky News Daily podcast. The Russian and US foreign ministers have been meeting in Saudi Arabia for the first time since the war in Ukraine began 3 years ago. They've been discussing a Ukrainian peace deal. With the meeting taking place there, how has the kingdom become a global power breaker in President Trump's new world order? Right, let's chat again, shall we, to Daisy and Lee. So, have you got any embarrassing things you said about Donald Trump that you've been, deleting from your ex profile, or?
I might have said something in the pub once or twice, but I don't think I put it on my Twitter account. I
Very
hope not.
sensible.
My ex account.
Very sensible. It's interesting, isn't it, seeing someone like Sadiq Khan, because look, he has got these strongly held views about Donald Trump, and the US president's all about free speech, isn't he? But I guess it is a bit of a diplomatic dance you've got to play now.
Well, for sure. But I think that the fact of the matter is that in politics, I've always tried to take the view that you should play the ball, not the man, right? And that's always what I try to do in my politics. And I think, we have to... character does matter in politics, right? The character of a person, the character of a leader does matter. And I think people increasingly are more interested in personality politics and the personality of leaders. And therefore, you can see why people criticise people's character and behaviour and things that they say and the way they behave. But ultimately, I think people fundamentally judge politicians on how they deliver and what they deliver. And I think, for all of the hype and for everything that everyone says, every politician, the UK, Donald Trump, everybody else, they'll be judged on what they do.
You must have, I guess, got a bit of a sense of Donald Trump during your time in Number 10.
I think I was on quite a few of the calls, some with Theresa May, some with Boris Johnson, with Donald Trump, and he's exactly the person you see on TV. There was no difference when it was off camera. So
I'd love to have heard that hour-and-a-half chat with Putin and Trump. I mean, can you imagine? Yeah.
They are. I mean, the calls were extraordinary. I think many, Foreign Office and Number 10 civil servants been around a long time would say they'd never quite heard diplomatic conversations like them. But Donald Trump has been elected by the people of America, and I think there's a broader point which, I agree with, where we talk about politicians and we talk about delivery. And there's a reason why across the West people are moving away from traditional parties and institutions because they feel that they're not delivering them. They feel that their lives are worse than their parents and their grandparents, and they're looking for alternatives. And until we start to actually deliver for people, we're going to fall further and further into these trends of people moving away from the institutions that we've built.
I mean, do you think the Lib Dems have benefited from that as well, with people moving to different parties, not just Labour and the Conservatives?
Absolutely. I mean, look at the result we got in the general election. It was our best ever election result ever for our party, and now we're the largest third party that's existed in Parliament for 100 years. So certainly we've benefited, and we did hear on the doorstep throughout the general election, time and again, people saying everything is broken and nothing works. And there was a real kind of sweet spot that people wanted, where they wanted to know that there was a political party that had ideas on how to fix things, but they weren't so outlandish, they didn't believe that you could actually do it. And I think we hit that sweet spot, and that's why we got such a good result.
I mean, there is wider questions as well, isn't there, about, it's not just politics, it's also, if you look at the media, we look at ourselves, we look at institutions, across the UK and across the world. I guess people are starting to question, whether these things are working. It's absolutely right. Really interesting chat. Thank you both very much indeed. Still to come on the Politics Hub. In uncertain times, there's only one thing you can always count on during recess. The Lib Dems calling for Parliament to come back. We'll have a look back at the many times they've demanded a return to the green benches.
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8 o'clock, growing concern for the British couple detained in Iran. As it emerges, they've now been charged with espionage. Also ahead, fly tipping on a scale you've never seen before. We'll have a special report on the gangs who are making millions from waste crime. And I'll be speaking to the former landlord who's on a mission to save the British pub industry one pint at a time. All that and more on the UK Tonight at 8 o'clock.
We've come to one of Moscow's Cold War bunkers. It was built as a top-secret command centre.
Being here really feels like you're stepping back in time. I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent. A show of military might and menace. Courage, bravery and sacrifice will win the day. It's a new subject. They'll learn about combat drones and some how to handle a Kalashnikov. The Kremlin continues to put forward its own version of events, both present and past.
There's no mention of the fact that Russia invaded its neighbour. That's rewriting history, isn't it?
Now we have to read it carefully.
Vladimir Putin put forward his plan for a ceasefire in Ukraine, telling Kiev, pull out of your eastern territories and the war will end. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Vladimir Putin is already the Kremlin's longest-serving leader since Stalin. The question is, what will a fifth Putin term mean for Russia and the world? Why do you support Vladimir Putin, Mr. Segal?
I can't answer questions that stupid.
I've watched Vladimir Putin attempt to create a new world order. The St. Petersburg Economic Forum was the backdrop to Vladimir Putin's latest verbal volley that Russia could send missiles to other nations to target the West. Ambassador, I wonder, shall we have a quick word for Sky News? Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine?
Swedish media, oh my God, you're not afraid of being here.
American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, but was first on display. Russia says Evan Gershkovich was caught red-handed, but has never produced any evidence to back that up. Sky News. Get the full story first.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey, has said today the Prime Minister should recall Parliament to debate his plans for Ukraine. Now, it's obviously a very serious point, but we couldn't help but notice that in an increasingly uncertain world, the Lib Dems demanding the return of MPs to the Green benches is nearly always something you can count on.
We want the recall of Parliament so the government can put their case. We want the recall of Parliament. 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 We want the recall of Parliament.
So apparently under Ed Davey, the Lib Dems have called for Parliament to be recalled at least 10 times that we could find. What's going on, Daisy? Why do you hate holidays so much?
Look, I think it speaks to just the sheer number of crises we've had over the last few years. If you looked at some of those examples you had on the screen there, this is when we had people dying in the back of ambulances, during the winter crisis like no other. The virtual parliament when there were problems during the pandemic. Lots of examples of where actually it's been really important for when Parliament could have been having a debate about really important issues.
Recalling Parliament to open the pubs for the Lionesses World Cup final?
Absolutely, absolutely. No, that was a good one. And I tell you what, I am actually a signatory to the piece of legislation that's going to change the law so that we don't have to recall Parliament, so that we can go to the pub to celebrate Lionesses the next time they win.
There you go. I love it. I love it. Recalling Parliament. I mean, what is it? What do you reckon?
I think we'd have cross-party consensus for that particular vote. So I think we'd be happily.
Pubs, opening pubs?
Yeah. I think we'd, it's a vote winner from that.
Yeah, you can totally see how it would go down quite well. Do you think that? I'm interested to know your thoughts, Lee, on this whole thing about recalling Parliament. Does it make a difference if MPs do get to debate these things as soon as they happen, or actually is it something where it's about theatrics and performance more than anything else?
You can probably be both, I'd imagine. I think, but it depends on the scale of the issue. I think there are clearly serious issues where it's only right and proper that Parliament is recalled, that elected representatives do have the chance to debate them. There are certain things that is necessary. Some of those potentially, you may be not, and maybe it's a good photo op for the Lib Dem leader and things like that. But I think there's a judgment on all these things.
Yeah,
how many times was it? Did it actually go into a?
I don't know how many times he was successful. Yeah. I'll be honest. Maybe you can tell me that. Has it ever actually worked? Ed Davey calling for Parliament to be recalled? Or
I don't think it hasn't resulted, but it has put pressure on the government of the day to do certain things. So, for example, with that winter crisis, which was absolutely awful, it was the 1st January after Rishi Sunak had just become Prime Minister. Number 10 did scrabble around and pull together a sort of a one-day conference with health leaders to work out how to deal with it.
But it's never been recalled when he's asked.
Yes, but it's still got pressure, it's still got action from the government.
Okay, there you go. Thanks both very much indeed. Great to have you both on the programme today, Lee and Daisy there. Well, that is it from us tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Up next, though, it is the UK Tonight with Matt Barbette, and then you've got The World with Yalda Hakim after that. And blimey, it's been another pretty busy day for us on the Politics Hub, but I'll see you tomorrow evening at 7.